I would like to start with your clarifying for us. What is your read on China's stance on Russia's war in Ukraine? It seems to me like there's a lot of strategic ambiguity.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it. China is basically trying to have its cake and eat it too. And it's still, I think, trying to work out what it wants to do in the longer term with China-Russia relations. So it's quite clear that China does not endorse Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They seem to be taken by surprise. They've said that what's happening is not what they want to see. They've called for de-escalation. They've sent humanitarian aid to Ukraine. They're really pushing peace talks very hard. But at the same time, China has made a long-term strategic decision that closer ties with Russia are in its interest as US-China strategic competition heats up for the longer term. So China's not going to sanction Russia, certainly not going to condemn Russia. And the question right now, which we're seeing a lot of uncertainty about, is just to what extent is China willing to incur costs in the form of Western sanctions or geopolitical pushback to help Russia out. And my view is that China still seems unlikely to directly get involved in Russia's invasion, given the huge geopolitical fallout.
So what it sounds like to me is that Xi Jinping has not necessarily decided what to do, and it's not a day-by-day situation, but it is something that he will pivot as needed. What would influence China to pick a side?
Yeah, I think that Xi Jinping has some room to pivot, but within some fairly clear boundaries. I just note that Xi Jinping is very much personally invested in and identified with closer China-Russia relations in Beijing. He has a very close geopolitical bromance, you could call it, with Vladimir Putin. They've met 38 times, a huge number of diplomatic encounters since 2012 when Xi became leader. So walking back in a big way from Putin or coming out and disowning Russia or punishing Russia for its invasion in a really visible way, that's going to have political downsides for Xi, especially as we approach what's called the 20th Party Congress later this year, which is a twice-a-decade leadership reshuffle where Xi's aiming for a norm-defying third term as leader. So he doesn't want to admit error, project weakness, and potentially compromise his position to get more of his allies into top leadership roles there. So I think that's certainly a constraint. But what we might see is if the fighting keeps escalating, if there is increasing regional insecurity, if the economic costs especially start really becoming acute for China in terms of the fallout from global energy prices, sanctions that are closing in, then that's where we might see more effort by Beijing to push peace talks and play something of a mediating role. Although that's still far from looking likely at the moment.
Right, we're not there yet. How much do we know about what the people in China are aware of when it comes to the war in Ukraine? I know that Xi Jinping doesn't take his marching orders from the populace, but what do people in China want? And can they push Xi or influence how Xi decides to move next?
I don't think public opinion will have a big effect on China's response to the Ukraine crisis. What research that has come out thus far shows that there is a mix of popular reactions in China. There's certainly a great degree of support for Putin and Russia, which is probably potentially more reflective of propaganda and censorship than what actually might be the case of public opinion in China. But there's also a range of people who have very mixed views or who blame Russia for getting the Ukraine and the world and China into this mess.
Should we presume that President Biden and Xi Jinping will hold some kind of summit or at least a conversation on this at some point? And if they do hold one, is just even holding some kind of conversation a success in terms of US-China relations and making progress on getting China to articulate its stance on Russia?
So both the US and Chinese readouts of the meeting between Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi, China's top diplomat, yesterday, were comparatively moderate in tone compared to recent US-China diplomacy. And the US readout did emphasize the importance of maintaining open lines of communication. So we think that it is likely that there could be a Biden-Xi call in the next few days about Ukraine. But if that didn't happen, or even if it did happen, but it wasn't a very productive conversation, that's certainly a pretty ominous sign for US-China relations, given how China's relationship with Russia after the Ukraine invasion really could be a kind of tipping point in terms of just how set Washington and Beijing are in this mode of strategic competition.
You had mentioned the pain from higher gas prices, higher oil prices on China's economy. We know that the Chinese stock market is in a bit of a meltdown mode at the moment. There's certainly increased scrutiny on its big tech companies, and there's also the lockdown of entire cities, which threatens to slow economic growth as well. How does this influence Beijing's thinking on how it proceeds with Russia? Will it influence how Beijing treats this, where it stands geopolitically, or even at the margin?
I think that building economic pain for China is one of the few factors that really could push Beijing to try and do more to defuse the conflict in Ukraine, and perhaps even to lean on Russia to de-escalate or end the invasion. We're not, as I said, we're not quite there yet, but if the pain does keep on growing, this is a really important thing for Xi Jinping. I mean, China's domestic economic performance is still identified in its internal party documents as the #1 priority for the Chinese Communist Party. And it's especially important for Xi as he approaches the 20th Party Congress. An economic recession or sharply declining performance in the stock market, that's going to unsettle other people in the party, and that's going to make his job more difficult to get his allies into top political places at that Congress.
So if the domestic economy and supporting it is the #1 priority for Xi Jinping and for his party, does that mean China would be more likely to offer military assistance, as reports have made clear, or at least suggested, or would it be more likely to offer economic assistance?
I think the reports that we have so far about China possibly providing some type of assistance to Russia's invasion, they're very unspecific. They're suggestions that these are conversations that were part of a broader set of weapons deals that were not related to the Ukraine invasion. But still, if they were to go ahead, I think that would be Xi really choosing his ideological relationship with Russia over his economic interests with the West and the EU. Washington, at least, has been very clear that if China does provide sanctions relief or backfilling to Russia, that it will impose quite severe sanctions on China. And I think that a number of European countries, maybe even the EU, would probably follow suit, given just how high the strategic stakes for them are of a Russian land war in Europe. So I think that the economic piece makes it still unlikely that China is going to provide any kind of significant direct support for Russia's invasion, although China has made clear that it will continue to trade and invest with Russia. And there's a lot that they can do while still going by the letter, at least, of the sanctions placed on Moscow.
What's the #1 thing you worry about, Neil? What keeps you up at night when it comes to China and Russia?
I think what I worry about most is precisely this balance between what is most important for Xi Jinping. Is it ideology or is it economics? And I think there's actually a lot of tension between those two goals in China's foreign policy, because we've seen Xi walk back a number of policies already, such as common prosperity in the domestic sphere, because of plunging stock market performance and because of this kind of constraint of at least being able to deliver economic growth to the majority of Chinese people and keep living standards rising. That said, I still think there's a lot of room for China to do more in terms of supporting Russia, in terms of advancing its own vision of global order, whilst not kind of impacting that bottom line of growth. And I think China will do all that it can to support Russia without violating the legal letter of the sanctions that the West has placed on Moscow.